All right. As I was sitting down with my good friend Chip this morning, he reads the agenda and he says, the art and science. He says, I didn't know you were an artist. And I was about ready to give Chip a snappy answer, and then I had a flashback to the third grade. And I remembered in the third grade when we were working on art and I got in trouble for eating my glue. So maybe I should have come up with a different title. Not an artist. All right. How many people in the room have ever been involved in a pollinator project that you've done where sometime in the future, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, it's like, well, that didn't turn out very well. Anybody? If there's not many of you, we're going to pivot to my third grade art. So, okay, a few of you. If you come to this presentation thinking that you're going to hear information about seeding rates, which plant species to use, how to plant them, when to plant them, that sort of thing, ain't happening. What you're going to hear about today is the things that you, the land manager, the corporation, the federal governmental agency, the state agency, whatever, have to think about, and you have to determine and lay out before you start, that will determine how that seed mixture is going to be designed for you. So I probably should have called it the art and science of before you start. So if you raised your hand that you ever had one of those projects that was like, well, that didn't quite turn out the way I want, I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about that you have to identify to whoever is going to make your seed mixture. If you don't tell them these things, you might fall a little short. So this presentation is based on 3 foundational premises. The first is, if you go back to Chip's presentation and you remember the map of 24 million acres of grassland that were converted into cropland in just a 4-year period, we have to make every single acre that we do get the best it can be. We don't have the luxury of not having that. I'll go back to Chip's talk and some of the other ones again. If we try to solve this issue, whether it's monarch butterflies or honeybees or whatever, using the exact same tools that we've been using for the last 10 years, 20 years, we will fail. We have to think about how to get things done a little bit differently. And then the other platform that I come to you today off of is not all pollinator habitat is created equal. So here we go. That's what everybody wants. When you turn the calendar on your desk to the month of July and there's the photo of the beautiful meadow with flowers, that's what everybody wants. If you're in a corporation, when you're talking to the leadership of the organization, and you say, hey, let's do pollinator habitat. That's what they think it's going to look like. And it can, but it also cannot. And so I'm going to try to chat about a few things today to give you a different perspective of what you have to identify to get it to look like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about 5 factors. I'm just going to use 5 as an example. And in this example, the first factor we're going to call geography. And think of this like a filter. In every place that there's a hole, that represents a plant that will work in your geography. So all kinds of plants in the country, not all of them are going to work in your area. So wherever there's a hole, that represents a plant that will work in your area. Soil type, same thing. Maybe you're sandy. Maybe you have clay. Maybe it's wet. Maybe it's dry. Whatever your project's objectives are, wherever there's a hole, that represents a plant that's going to work. Pollinator value, I appreciated the presentation a couple ago that talked about pollinator value. I'm going to talk about that. Not all plants that are flowering really provide much pollinator value. So we'll chat about that a little bit more coming on. Vegetative height, I'm going to use this as an example in like if you're in a solar project and you want to have pollinator value, well, there's probably this little consideration called vegetative height that might be in there. And one more I'll give you, cost. I don't care if you're a landowner or a corporation, there's a budget. That should be factored into these things as well. So here's the deal. You take all of these factors, and there's more than 5, but in every one of these cases where there are holes in there that represent plants that will work, you lay all those factors on top of each other, and where all the holes align, that's a plant species that will work for you, that can be used in there. And when they don't align, you'll have plant species that don't work. So now we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but I want you to understand that factor. Because if somebody comes to you and says, here you go, this is what we say is a great pollinator mixture, and they haven't thought about all of these other things because you haven't told them that, you're not going to get the greatest value. And that can be one of the reasons why you have less than stellar results. Here, I gave you 5 factors. Here's a few more. I'm going to talk about some of these. These factors are determined by the land manager, the corporation that owns the land, and that sort of thing. They will be different for each project. So a seed mixture, a pollinator project, should be custom designed for your objectives, your factors, your piece of ground. Okay? So here we go. Geography. Anybody know what this plant is? Anybody? I didn't catch that, but it's anise hyssop. Okay? You name the pollinator species. This is like when you're in college on Friday night going to the bar that you liked. Everybody loves this. It's the pollinator bomb. It's inexpensive. Here's the problem. Its happy home is not in a lot of the country. If you're in that area up on top here, that's great. Great thing to use. Geography is one of the things that you have to think about. Soil type. Chatted about this a little bit earlier, but on the left you have a great plant that grows on sandy soil. On the right you have a Liatra species that's growing on a heavier soil. If you have a project that has multiple soil types, you got a wet area, you got an upland area, that really needs to have 2 different mixtures that you're going to use. So you really want to be providing that kind of guidance coming back. Pollinator value. Anybody know what this field is right here, what the main plant is in there? Black-eyed Susan. Found throughout almost all the 48 states, inexpensive, shows up quickly, boom, you got pollinator value, or you have pollinator that people can see. One of the things that personally frustrates me a little bit is when people see something flowering and they think that means it has pollinator value. Check that plant out because it's in every one of your projects, because it's really cheap and it shows up. Tell me when you've ever seen anything more than a fly land on it to rest. Minimal, low pollinator value. I put it in all my mixes because it's cheap, shows up, and people see color that's out there. But if that is supposed to be carrying the load of your pollinator value, probably we didn't quite hit a home run here. So pollinator value, which I'll chat about in a little bit more detail here, is something that you really need to think about. And that can go back to whoever the expert is that's designing your plant species, but make sure that in your seed mixture, you're including the species that are truly going to provide pollinator value. One of the ways that we can make sure that we're doing that is by putting lots of things in there. don't worry about what the names are in this chart, in this graph. What you want to take from this graph is the more plant species you're using in your mixture, the more pollinator species you're benefiting. Okay? And another way of going about this is to use something that we call a seed calculator. Don't worry about the numbers that are in there, but a seed calculator will show you all kinds of things like how many seeds there are per square foot. But this calculator does something else that I think is really important that you need to know as the person that's putting together a pollinator project. And it actually goes in and it provides a pollinator score for the plant species that are in there. Two speakers earlier, was it Matt? Is that the name? Matt? Fish and Wildlife Service? Forester? Well, okay, so I'm getting everything wrong. His name's probably not even Matt. Where is he in the room? Oh, he's outside. All right. Never mind. Okay. I was very interested, and I'm going to look at his data set because they give a pollinator value as well. So what this does, and this is the kind of thing that you want, not only does it give you the typical information, what bloom period, seeding rate, and all that kind of stuff, but at the end, you get a score, a pollinator value for your mixture. If you're not getting this kind of information, you might just be shooting in the dark. If you built the back of your pollinator mixture on something like Black-Eyed Susan, that'd be a pretty darn low score. So those are really important factors that you need to have, and you're going to get those by talking about what your objectives are. Vegetative height, I love putting this one in here because one of the just exploding opportunities to significantly affect pollinator habitat is by combining pollinator and solar. Okay? Anybody in the room working in that area? Few of you? Nice. Well, there's this little factor that you have to consider called vegetative height. If somebody gives you a pollinator mixture and says, this is the world's greatest pollinator mixture, and about half of it is 4 feet tall, is that going to work inside the array on a solar project? I don't think so. So those are things that you have to look at. And let me tell you, it's challenging. If your height limitation is like 18 inches, 24 inches, you're probably going to use a lot of things like this. And no criticism to this project, but what's this plant species right there? Black-Eyed Susan. And what do we know? Not the greatest pollinator value. Cost. Talked about that one. Another significant factor, whether you are a landowner or you're a corporation or a Department of Transportation, you have budgets. And if somebody designs a mixture and says this pollinator mixture is the bomb, but it costs $900 an acre, you're probably not going to get a lot of it to happen out on the landscape. So for me, cost is just as important a factor as all these other things that have to be determined. So a couple other potential factors that you need to think about as a land manager to tell somebody that's going to design a seed mixture for you is, what pollinator species do you want to benefit? I read lots of permitting regulations and things that talk about how they want to benefit honeybees, and then very specifically the plant species that honeybees need are not included in the seed mixture. So that can be fine, but you want to decide what you want to benefit. And if you want to benefit all pollinator species, great, even better, but that will help guide how a seed mixture is constructed. Future management. There is nothing that we're ever going to do where we plant it, walk away from it, and always have great pollinator value. We have to think about future management, and future management will dictate a little bit of what plant species you're going to put in your mixture. I'm just guessing that if you're on a solar project or a highway department, prescribed fire is probably not one of your tools. Okay? We need to know what the tools are on the front end, because that will help determine what plant species to put into a seed mixture. And this is just a really important one to think about on any kind of a pollinator project, because if you don't have future management, you're not going to get the results and maintain the results that you probably want. Native versus a naturalized plant species, another thing that you can consider. If part of your objectives are to do a prairie restoration, you're over here exclusively using native species. If prairie restoration is not one of your objectives, maybe you're going into ag land and you're doing a project that's going to be there for 5 or 10 years and you want to benefit honeybees, then you might well include some foraged legume species. But you have to decide that on the front end before you have a seed mixture built. Critter attractiveness. I won't ask you who this is because you probably won't get it, but this is called ashy sunflower, Helianthus mollis. In my part of the world, very challenging to ever find a flower because the deer eat every single flower. It's like laying out bite-sized Snickers for me. So think about this. If you are a Department of Transportation, would you want to be laying out one of the most attractive things to deer along your roadsides? No. That's an objective. That's a factor that you need to think about and identify on the front end. These are all unique to your project, but if you haven't identified these things and passed them along, we're probably not going to be able to design the best mixture for you. All right, so here's a couple of do's to wind things down here. The most important thing that will determine your overall success, site preparation. We've heard it in other presentations. Never scrimp on site preparation. Never feel like, I want to plant it now, I don't want to wait 6 months. Anytime you're 3 years, 5 years in the future and you're unhappy with what you got, it almost always goes back to site preparation. Seeds per square foot, make sure that however your seed mixture is being designed, it's about how many seeds are in the mixture per square foot. A more advanced way of going about it. Make sure that you have great seed-soil contact. Work with lots of people that want to take something that's in existing grass and convert it to pollinator habitat. And if you have terminated that existing grass, which you would need to do, but the grass residue is still there, you're going to have a hard time getting that seed to contact the soil to be able to germinate and grow. That's why we use things like drills, because you're ensuring that that seed is giving you seed-soil contact. Future management, talked about that. You have to know what is available for future management before you start. Because once the seed goes in the ground, your tools are incredibly limited. And the last one for the do is weed competition. We've also heard this in other presentations. Very important, you have to figure out what you're going to do when you have a problem. So just as importantly, there are some don'ts. And here's a couple of my don'ts that I would pass along. The first is, sometimes I hear, we're going to plant the grass in year 1, and then in year 2 we'll come along and plant the forbs. Okay? This is me racing Usain Bolt in the 100-yard dash. If he pops a hamstring and falls down, I could win. The likelihood is very, very low, but technically I could win. That's what that's like. Technically, the forbs could show up, but they won't. The next don'ts is, I've already said it, never scrimp on site preparation. It is the most important thing that you're doing. And really the whole thrust of this presentation, don't go forward until you, land manager, corporation, agency, have defined what your factors are. And it's really on you to identify those before you ask for a seed mix. So it can look like that. It will look like that when you follow that sort of a plan. So here's a summary. For those of you that thought this was going to be a presentation where we talked about the number of seeds per square foot and use this species and plant it this way and all that sort of thing, it's not what this was, but you can get that on March 14th in a webinar with the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, Sand County Foundation, and the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. March 14th, you register for it, it's recorded, it will be there, and that sort of thing for the future. So I would encourage you to check that out, and you'll get the level of detail that you want. And then we also do this thing called Pollinator Habitat Tips that you can sign up for free that talk about different pollinator values. So I thank you for your time and your attention today, and I would be happy to take a question if there was one.
I'll just add.
Or show my artwork.
We have your webinar on our calendar too. So if you're wanting more details, you can go to the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website.
Elizabeth? The question was, will I be sharing my seed calculator? If you come and have a conversation with me one-on-one, I probably will. There's some proprietary information, but the answer is yes, but just come and see me.
Hi, you talked about critter attractiveness.
Yes?
And so palatability to wildlife. Where would you find that information?
I have it from personal experience of being out there, so that's a great question. But I'm going to answer your question this way. Work with somebody that has the experience about all of those kinds of factors. So if that's important for you, and I threw that in there at the last minute because of the Department of Transportation stuff, and it was like, well, God, I really wouldn't want to put ashy sunflower along a roadside because, seriously, the deer just, it's deer candy. So just make sure you're working with somebody that has a broad base of experience about all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that was a great answer for you, but that's what you get.
One more short question.
One more? Before the microphone gets there, I do want to make one disclaimer. It was never proven that I ate my glue. It was an alleged event. I want to get that out there. All right, sorry.
My question might not be appropriate. I come from a totally different sector, which is the homeowner native plant gardening sector. But is there something about right-of-way habitat that would prevent fall or winter seeding?
My opinion is no. The higher the diversity your seed mixture, if you remember that chart, the more plants you use, the more pollinator species you benefit. The more plant species you include in your mixture, I believe they perform better with a dormant seeding in the fall because you have that freezing and thawing action of the winter to help break seed dormancy and that sort of thing.
And the snow helps with soil contact.
Yep. And that question will be answered thoroughly on March 14th on a webinar with 3 different agencies out there. All right, I'm here until Friday at noon, and I would love to chat with anybody. I geek out on this stuff, so
Great.
come and see me.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.